Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to today's talk on a rather unusual subject on which we don't have too many talks at the center, but by a very eminent and qualified person to deliver the talk. Professor Krishnendu Ray is going to speak to us today on Aftertaste of Empire. I understand this is also the title of his forthcoming book, if I'm not giving anything away. And basically, from what I understand, is his main concern is why has good taste not featured as part of geopolitical imaginations or analysis of geopolitics. And he's obviously is going to say a fair bit on that subject. I'm not going to, in advance, let you know what he has to say. I have some sense, having spoken to him earlier, about this. But let me briefly introduce Professor Ray, old friend, colleague, guru for several of us, but currently professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at NYU. He was the chair of the department from 2012 to 21 and is the author of The Migrant's Table, 2004, The Ethnic Restaurateur, 2016, and the co-editor of Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food in South Asia, 2012, and Practicing Food Studies, most recently, 2024. He was a faculty member and the Dean of Liberal Arts at the Culinary Institute of America, famously or infamously called CIA, 1996 to 2005, and the president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society from 2014 to 18. He's also been an editor of the Food Studies journal, Gastronomica. So very warm welcome, Krishnendu, once again to CSDS. Your last talk, if I remember, was on menus in American hotels, but great topic, and looking to listen to you again. 45 minutes?
Okay, perfect. To turn that, perfect. Thanks a lot. First, thank you, Ravikant, for, where's Ravikant? There he is, for suggesting it. Thanks, Deepu, and welcome so many friends and colleagues and people I have talked to remotely, never had a opportunity to talk to directly. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and I'm hoping we're going to get some robust back and forth. This is a project in making, and I like presenting my work at this stage because then your response to it gives me a productive feedback, and I'm looking to see the gaps in my own work and my own thinking. And I mean, the one side of specialization is a certain kind of narrow-mindedness, and sometimes it's productive, sometimes it's unproductive. So I'm going to talk about one chapter today, and I'm going to set my alarm a little bit so I get a heads up. I'm going to have to finish things. This chapter is titled Aftertaste of Empire, as Deepu said, Cultural Imperialism and Asian Culinary Nationalisms, where I use, and you will see some of the data, quantitative analysis of Michelin. Oh, can we get the thing up? What do I do to get the PowerPoint? Perfect. Lovely. Is that good? Let's start with the first one. Yeah, you see the title there, where I will look at some quantitative data and then in some ways what can be crudely called discourse analysis. In the process, I provide a critique of what I say are less productive ways of studying the relationship between soft power and gastrodiplomacy, which suffer from inadequate theorization of the hierarchical structure of the world economy and, I think, geocultural system, where I show that when there's a lot of loose talk about soft power, and in this book and this chapter specifically, I show why 90% of nation states cannot even play in the domain of culinary soft power. So the assumption in a lot of the soft power literature, taking the example of Japan, Thailand, Korea, etc., as I will show, gives this idea that anyone can play with soft power without the hard power behind it. I'll talk a little bit about it. And one of the other chapters that I'm not going to talk about today is this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to elaborate on it. What I'm not going to talk about today is called this chapter is called Street Food: The Death March of the Peasantry. I use political economic analysis, ethnographic method of 45 street vendors, interviews, and supply chain in cities of the global south and north to connect peasant and peddler economies, where one of my major critiques is in fact going to be methodological nationalism. We miss the picture if I just look at the world from New York City. I miss the picture if I just look at the world from New Delhi. And and this, of course, goes back to my professors in some ways with qualification, Wallerstein and Giovanni Arrighi, and you will see echoes of their work here. My argument here is that historical capitalism and state socialism have been equal culprits in the decimation of the peasantry through state or market-based strategies of developmentalism, which is why we find very few street vendors in fully developed capitalist and socialist societies until they fail. That death march of the peasantry produces the brilliant flaring of street foods that has been appropriated, aestheticized, and sentimentalized without much critical analysis by the urban upper and middle classes. The little criticism that has been targeted, such sentimentalizing of street food, levels the mild and analytically weak concept of gentrification of food that I think fails to connect street foods to the slow death of the peasantry. And the last chapter that I'm going to reference today and then dive a little bit deeper is called Euro-American Theories of Eating. This is chapter 4, which is about limits of disciplinarity, but also problems of undisciplined work. The field I'm coming from, food studies, in fact, has a lot of the liabilities of undisciplined work, but it's trying to get around the limits of disciplinarity. And there are some challenges in both those directions. So kind of this is where those of you who are kind of familiar with some of this literature, this is where I engage with Anne-Marie Moll's work in anthropology. Eating in Theory came out a couple of years ago. Arguably the leading anthropologist talking about food. She's in Amsterdam. Alan Ward at Manchester. He probably the leading sociologist, deals with cultural sociology of taste, and Stephen Shapin's recent work, which is Eating and Being, which comes out of science and technology studies, basically history. And I'm going to, that's the big project. The focus here today to pay a little, let's see, attention to it. Let me kind of begin with these two epigrammatic kind of quotes. You can look at that, and you will also listen to me talk through it. So Oscar Wilde, wildly as he is capable of doing, in fact, he says the whole of Japan is a pure invention. There's no such country. There are no such people. The Japanese people are, as I've said, simply a mode of style and exquisite fancy of art. And those of you who you are eating globally in any global city today, you can see what he's, in some ways, what he already predicted about 100 years ago, but he was, of course, saying it in the context of Japonisme, in the context of Impressionism. Okay, this is 100 years later. And in fact, you can see this whole book as a response, an extended response to Madhur Jaffrey's quip to me once. We were doing an interview on NPR in New York City. She said, you study food. Can you explain to me why do Americans love the food of the people they have gone to war with? This is the answer. 100,000 word answer to Madhur Jaffrey's question. So hidden in these two quips, you see, of course, is a certain relationship, I'll point out, between taste and geopolitics, and maybe given the chasm between the quotidian and the grand, that might be inevitable that gap. Yet the gap grows more glaring with the current international tumult. The second Trump administration has ruptured the post-war international institutional structure of governance under US hegemony in a way that has made everyone's awareness of geopolitics more acute, revealing the seams of the system that was taken for granted. And I think that exactly what makes visible what felt so natural about taste. That's one of the challenges about taste. It feels natural once we love it. It feels obviously it is great. Obviously, omakase menus and sushi is great. It was not so obvious to people 30 years ago in most parts of the world. In fact, if you ask any American, no one had predicted that people are going to eat rice and raw fish. And Americans are lapping it up. So it's a radical transformation in taste. And that happens in the context of some of this change. We're going to talk about it today. As Deepu pointed out, discussions of good taste are unaccounted for with little geopolitical insight. And here the question, and I'll invite you to kind of help me think through it. Is it because the aesthetic form of food has no relationship to its interstate system, unlike, say, literature, which there's a vast literature on it, movies, music, people in this room have worked on it, architecture? Is it because the dense materiality of food, its voluptuousness, its warm and staining our fingertips, chewed in the mouth, smell in the nostrils, are difficult to theorize in an abstract way? Is it the palpability of literal taste that leads to its kind of least successful fictionalization? At least that's what Aniket Jawari says in his powerful book on touch and taste. So the question for me, and I don't have an easy answer to this, as you will see, is what is eating analogic to? Is it like sex? So in some ways, there's a literature on food porn, okay? Is it touching? Is it listening? Is it seeing? And of course, I will point a little bit on how eating is different from maybe listening to music. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about it, about intimacy, about publics, about the shape and size of the public, etc. So in some ways, eating remains one of the touchstones of proximate reality against representation. Hence the explosive power of touchability. And I don't have to tell you about the power of touchability. I have to assert that point a little more in New York than in New Delhi. The smell of race, which comes naturally. Think about, say, Mark Smith's work, where he says, okay, we know race is about color. Okay, let's set it aside and think of race as smell. What happens to race? Okay, and there's a rich literature basically on what race smells like. And that is very obvious to us when we think about class and caste in India in terms of what that smells like. So I'll try to change a little bit of this kind of what I think is a lack of theorization. Two related ways. Some of the connections have been theorized, as I've said before, soft power and gastrodiplomacy. And but as I gestured towards before, there's a kind of kind of voluntaristic constructions about soft power and gastrodiplomacy. And a lot of people, and here academics in the US, in India, are trying to get paid by the various governments to give them some money so they could do some soft power work, okay? As if anyone doing soft power work for any nation, it acquires soft power. I think that's unlikely to happen. So let's begin. I'll drive you a little deeper into the belly of the beast. I'm going to read out some of this so you don't have to kind of look through that. Here is a quote from Helen Rosner, who is the restaurant critic for The New Yorker. By the way, I'm theorizing this from a place, one particular place, and that's New York City, because I cannot theorize from everywhere. And so it's a look from New York City out and then comes back in. And of course, that invites all of your work from different parts of the world. In some ways, we do not have a God's eye view of it. We have a located view of it. And we will see what it looks like. And I'll try to describe some of it. Hence Helen Rosner, hence The New Yorker. She writes about Café Mart's, a nouveau Italianate American restaurant restaurant with an open kitchen, she says, is separated from the dining room by an emerald Norend curtain, one of the many signs of the restaurant's original interest in Japanese cuisine. The restaurant serves a pancake primavera, which she describes as a big, trembling okonomiyaki of Italian greens and pickled root vegetables. Okonomiyaki, of course, is a gesture towards Japanese aesthetic kind of style. Similarly, Jason Stewart, a restaurant critic from LA, gestures to a number of similar references when he goes visit Sonoma. Those of you who are keeping count, at one point declared by some people as the world's best restaurant, etc., world's 50 best, etc. This he wrote in 2023. There was the young green rice from Japan with green tofu made from the mostly soy but a little cow's milk, followed by crudités of the day's best leaves, berries, vegetables, and other bits, all sliced uniformly thin by hand with a special knife from Japan. Okay, so that requires so much cultural capital. Okay, the meal closed with an ice cream sandwich mimicking onigiri, the handheld Japanese rice ball swaddled in a seaweed sheet. 30 years ago, no one would have made that analogy. Okay, that an ice cream tastes like onigiri. Okay, that's very of this moment in some ways. So the triangularly molded ice cream is flavored with a fernet like Danish bitters and wrapped in a white sheet. Such references to Japanese ingredients, terminology, techniques, and style now are absolutely routine cliches. Okay, in the writing on food in global cities such as New York and London, and I suspect my friends have shown also in Shanghai, also in Hong Kong, also in Singapore. Okay, they have in fact kind of become absolutely necessary about it. So Rossner, in fact, is a very interesting literary restaurant critic. She has been quite critical of things like World's 50 Best. Here she's writing about Bazaar, note the name of it, is more or less a turn of the millennium culinary modernism grafted onto some second thing, Japan. The conceit that holds this compilation together is a 17th century journey of Hasekura Tsunenaga, a Japanese samurai of imperial descent. By the way, white boys love such gamifying reference to samurai. It's an essential part of that language of it. To the court of Japan, to the court of Spain, and the presumed culinary chimeras that emerged from that meeting, these kinds of incoherent hegemonic multiculturalism continue to be emphasized. And she goes on to write about isomorphism between Spanish and Japanese kitchen. She draws attention to the plancha and the teppan, which is a flat cooking surface, and josper and robata, which are coal-fired grill. Okay, one might point out politely that in fact coal-fired grilled meats and flat cookware can be found almost anywhere in the world. Okay, Turkey, India, Iran, Ghana, but none of this is reference. It's always gesturing towards between European and American and Japanese reference to it. Okay. It, of course, appears with cultural capital only in this kind of context. Even, I don't know if you have seen the movie Frederick Weissman's movie recently, which spends the last part of the film parsing how Japanese aesthetics and their family, the Toagra family, had been and understood Japanese aesthetic 25 years before. So today, to be a great French chef, today, to be a great American chef, you have to be completely familiar with Japanese things, or at least pretend that familiarity. Not true about most things, most other cuisines in the world. So these convergences in tastes are both material and, of course, in the eye of the beholder as a referent in hegemonic global discourses. And have to, as I gestured before, as I was preparing this talk, I was not very interested in looking at the food porn literature. At one point, I have dismissed that literature because it too easily dismisses people's engagement with something sensuous. But I think as I was rethinking this, I might have to look at eating more like sex than I am doing, and more like text, because mostly what I'm talking about is text about food. And we will get to, I haven't resolved this question in my head. And these are, of course, one of my bigger arguments is if you just look from New York City without engaging with the literature from other parts of the world, it stays in the echo chamber of it. In this case, Anika Jawari's work on practicing caste, which in some ways rehearses some of the work by Caroline Korsmeyer in Making Sense of Taste, which came out a little bit earlier, about hierarchy of taste, about the Kantian hierarchy of taste, etc. I will give you a couple of other examples. Hanya, I'm checking just my time. Yeah. Hanya Yanagihara, an American novelist, editor, and travel writer, provides the coda in a style section of T Magazine, which is the style section of the New York Times Magazine. Here, this is April 27th. She writes, it wasn't just that I finally understood how much of the aesthetic life had been wrought by my aesthetic life, she says, had been wrought by Japan. It was that I understood that I was somewhere that had determined much of the modern world's aesthetic preoccupations. It felt stubbornly sui generis, a place that had remained distinctly apart, despite all its trappings of modernity and globalization, a place whose visual and artistic sensibility, though much of it originated in China and Korea. By the way, that's a technique that is repeatedly used, which is Japan is always separated from China in this analysis. China is still cheap stuff. Japan is cool, stylish, elite stuff. Okay. That separation is essential to valorizing Japanese. And of course, this is also going to play out in interesting ways in the upcoming hegemonic struggle, as we see already now. So she underlines the importance not only of Japanese associated food that you have seen examples of, including matcha, by the way. The longest lines in New York City today are for matcha. Okay. Also of pop music, also fandom, those of you who are otaku, okay, fashion, and I'm going to talk a little bit, especially of men's fashion, and architecture, even attitudes such as the joy of tidiness. I don't know how many of you follow Marie Kondo, okay, even the power of cuteness. Okay. A lot of these things happened organically, and part of my story is how it happened, but much of it was also packaged and propagated by a government in what it called the Cool Japan Initiative since 2010. And I'm going to talk a little about it. Yanagihara gestures toward what I see to be kind of what I plan to do here in this piece, but stop short when she writes, I quote, celebrating a culture is different from venerating a country. Although this issue isn't about Japan's geopolitical past or present, reading the articles in it is to be confronted with Japan's modern history. And two things about it, she's very sharp about it. The brutality it inflicted upon others, the brutality inflicted upon it. Okay. And she kind of articulates that and kind of just gets there and lets it go. So you can see my work is kind of do the next steps in that. There's another one, another person who you want to follow, who in fact just became the main restaurant critic of the New York Times, which is Ligaya Mishan, the most recent New York Times restaurant critic. In the same issue, discusses this politics of cuteness, which she relates after Murakami to Japan's humbling defeat of imperial ambitions, post-war occupation, and the Vietnam War, leading to a politics of, and I quote Murakami here, self-medicated denizens of a castrated nation state, pampered children enthralled by their own cuteness, end quote. Cute is the opiate of the people. She concedes, but then it opens up with a question. She opens it up with a question. Or has this embodiment of powerlessness become itself a kind of power? And we'll talk about that. And that's the thing about food. In some ways, it's easy to talk about food because it doesn't seem to threaten other things. Okay, so everyone is an expert on food because of their experience about it. So she tries to bring some unruliness to this cuteness business, but there's no escaping the fact that, and this is kind of, I'm maybe jumping ahead here, that cuteness in fact depends on the infantilizing patronage of the powerful. We appear cute, the powerful, a product, I think, of imperial domination. Okay, so we can go back to our Oscar Wilde quote. Okay, Wilde was commenting on the question of mimesis in Japonisme in particular, and art more generally. Those of you who follow Impressionism, Impressionism was strongly impacted by the style, the materiality, the subject matter, okay, of what was happening in Edo, especially in the Edo period, including things like urban life. If you look at Degas, if you look at Manet, and their kind of attention both to the beautiful, the parks, but also nightlife. Okay, that's very, very directly Japonisme coming in other direction. So there's a section on geopolitics where I talk about this kind of a little more structure. And in some ways, for those of you familiar a little bit with the sociological literature, this brings capitalism to all the discussion about cultural capital. And one of the criticisms made of Pierre Bourdieu's distinction is we get a lot about capital, culture and social, but there's no capitalism in it. Okay, so this is in some ways an attempt to bring some of that. And my focus is the last 50 years, New York City, and where I say some soft bits of cultural material clings to some of this analysis. I mostly find the discussions of soft power, as I said, inadequate. Most of that discussion is about how Japan, Italy, Thailand, take a couple of other nations, Peru, Mexico, have paid, for instance, one of the main consecrating organizations, which is Michelin Guide. And remember, Michelin Guide is a tire company, right? And who invented French cuisine by driving to it. Because remember, the 3-star, it means a place worth driving to just for the food. Okay, that's why a tire company is in the context of consecration of this. And I reference some of the literature. And those of you who have read, say, Golden Arches East about a generation ago, in some ways, this is the other side of it. In its essential argument, Golden Arches East was in fact an argument against geopolitical analysis via the concept of globalization, the global turned local. Okay. Furthermore, it focuses on one dimension of imperialism, which is about the aesthetic forms the imperial center imposes on the rest of the world. In this case, hamburgers and Coca-Cola. And for the last 10 years, I've also taught at the Slow Food University in Italy. Their concern is very similar, which is the imperial imposition. What I'm interested in is, in fact, the flow in the other direction under conditions of imperialism. Okay. So in contrast, there's a beautiful recent book called Imperial Wine, which connects a Mediterranean product to the British market. And I'll reference two other, those who are interested in it, two other texts that are crucial to my argument. So my work is analogous to these formulations, but of shorter duration and wider ambit. And this is James Farrar and David Wang's The Global Japanese Restaurant, which is what is amazing and powerful about it. They do research in a dozen global cities in a dozen languages. Okay, in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Bangkok, in Singapore. And one of the strongest arguments connecting geopolitics to two things, demographic change and cultural politics of good taste, that retains a sense of the unequal world, unlike the soft power literature. Okay, and the other book is Mark Padungpart's The Flavors of Empire, which is probably has influenced my work most, and it'll be partly a dialogue with him, which is about how Americans developed a taste for Thai food long before any one of them met anyone from Thailand. Okay. And before there was any Thai migration, which is usually the pattern. And my last book, Ethnic Restaurateur, was in fact about that. My first book, The Migrant's Table, is about that, how migration influences it. But you can be exposed to these cultural worlds without migration. So what is that exposure? Okay. So, and this is how his work shows how Padungpat says this relationship was directly related to the Vietnam War and American GI's destination of Bangkok to satisfy their two appetites. Remember, Thailand is an American ally. Okay, so all those GIs fighting in Vietnam are going to Bangkok. That's why we have the sex trade there. That's why we have the food trade there. Okay, and for young men, okay, two major appetites, food and sex. Okay, and if you read any memoir of wars, you see it's an immensely boring and terrifying experience, and constantly erupts in the search for this appetite, these two appetites around it. So this is US soldiers are going to Thailand under protection of a US geopolitical ally, which is where we get, and this is the construction, I think my work will develop this, military touristic standardizations. We usually keep these things separate, such as, for instance, red, green, and masaman curry and pad Thai, as if that's what every Thai eats all the time. Okay, that engagement in taste was driven by Cold War geopolitics and American imperialism directly. Okay, so, and this is the sequencing. Wars bring journalists, I know some of you are, who not only cover the war, but also file lifestyle stories to pay for their sojourn. When you're there, the editors want some other stories too, lifestyle stories, which drives tourist interest. And we see in some of these cases, invaders often come as tourists the second time around. Okay, as Madhur Jaffrey quipped, as you saw that, which this is an extended answer to that question, that has happened with Thailand in the course of the Vietnam War. It has happened to Vietnam more directly, that I'm going to dig into. It has happened to the Republic of Korea, otherwise known as South Korea. Exactly. Okay, used and most importantly for our purposes, Japan. Okay, so one can even explain the American rediscovery, in fact, of Italian food as a post-war phenomena. Okay, the result of US occupations in conjunction with domestic demographic change that I have talked about in my previous work. So I'm going to skip this section, which I have a long section on Orientalism and cultural imperialism, and I don't want to bore you with it, which is, of course, on this question of literature and cultural power in some ways. We might argue with him in terms of its specificity, but it's about, in fact, imperialism and cultural form, specifically in terms of literature. And of course, remember, he opens Orientalism with that kind of powerful example where someone can be both an agent of imperialism and a kind of a reporter on its misdeeds. Okay, Heart of Darkness being the classic example about it. So I develop in the next sections. One is called Euro Harness of perfect 15 minutes on US restaurant criticism, where I talk about the long Eurocentric shadow of restaurant criticism until about the 1980s. American restaurant critics are not talking about anything other than European standards in food. Rest is all called ethnic food that I have criticized in the ethnic restaurant, which is something we don't want to pay a lot of money for, something that is reduced to spicy, which of course is a peculiar kind of a conflation because spicy is usually chili, but chili comes in fact from the West, doesn't come from the East. It's an Occidental thing. And then it conflates two things: spiciness of chilies and spices as aromatics. And the reduction that cheap, poor people's food is spicy, which in fact is absurd inversion. Until 1750, no one ate more spicy food than European elites. We don't know that. We forget about that because of this peculiar naturalizing logic about who eats spicy food, including people like me who eat spicy food. We essentialize it, okay? But in fact, the most spicy food in Europe were eaten by European elites until the big divergence between Europe and the rest of the world, which is the 18th century. And in fact, spices then get contaminated by popularity, lower class association, and the East becomes poor rather than exotic and rich. Okay, that flip happens. As that flip happens, this kind of we see this criticism almost coming 50 years later. In this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about, these are, of course, some of the literature I talked to, about American criticism with music. Okay. And here's, I'm kind of wrestling how much of this is similar and how much of it this is different. And much has changed between the early days of jazz and those of hip hop. Think about it. When disenfranchised youth reacted to the exclusion from consumer capitalism with what they called rhythm and noise, conquering the world with their aesthetic form. Today, any art form, urban art form anywhere in the world would echo certain kind of hip hop sensibility, very different from, say, jazz relationship to classical European music. And here my question is, and I don't have an easy answer to that, why did it take so much longer for food in the United States to be the target of revaluation than music? Okay, music is almost 2 generations ahead in this kind of a criticism. Perhaps, as I said, because of its unavoidably embodied multisensorial nature, that it cannot be transmitted only as electrons, not yet. Okay, we don't live off electrons yet, we still eat food. Okay, so there's something going on here. Of course, media studies, mediation, which many of you are experts on, would be lovely to think through. A couple of other examples I'll give you here. But I dig in a little bit, some of these, I'm going to show you some some of the quantitative data. So my argument in this is the triumph of a certain kind of Japanese cuisine is related in part to the rise of post-war Japan as a major economic and cultural powerhouse. And my argument is soft power appears to follow economic power with a generation's lag, as we are seeing with South Korea today. By the way, South Africa is an interesting example. The only nation that shows up in any of these consecrating lists are French restaurants in South Africa associated with the wineries. Okay, that's the only African food that shows, African within quotes, food that shows up in any of these consecrating lists. So soft power follows hard power. It's very hard for me to make this argument because I probably argued endlessly with Wallerstein that should not be the case. That is not the case. It is the domain of autonomy, etc., etc. But the evidence seemed to be showing that the relationship with hard power and soft power in this particular case of haute cuisine almost is predictive in nature. So in a couple of slides, this is from Zagat's, I use in the book, number of sources. This is from 1986 to 2016, at that time frame. It's because that's where the data set ends. And you can see it's the average price of a meal in a consecrating list. Japanese reaches up to the top there by 2016. Okay. Then if you go down the list, of course, which I cannot see without my glasses. Okay. Then it's French and American. Continental is dying as a category, by the way, everywhere in the world, because we don't know exactly what it means. And then you have Spanish, Greek. And if you look at Greek and Korean, the rate of change is the highest there. You can see, if you just go back a little, you can see Korean thing coming up. That's between 1990 and 2001. This is median. This is average price for a meal, where I use price as a surrogate for prestige. And there's a lot of gap between the two, but that's the best data I can get about price and prestige around it. And there are other data set. And by the way, you can just send me an email and I can share all this data and a lot more. This is from Yelp, which is in some ways different from Zagat, but also popular. I just point out 2 things to you on this way. On the y-axis, you see Italian, Chinese, Mexican there. That's ranked by popularity. So if you're eating in New York City, the largest number of restaurants self-describe as Italian, a few thousand. Then it comes Chinese, then Mexican. Mexican is a very interesting case. I consider the Mexican case between high modernism and hip hop. And we will see how that plays out. That happens to Seoul too. Then you go Japanese. So Japanese is about 5th in popularity, but If you look on the other side, 8%, and the one especially after that, New American, 24%. If you call something New American, it is the most expensive restaurants. Okay. And on the green, this is the second set, the green on the right is basically high-end restaurant within that category. And something very predictable is going on, though everyone thinks we have gone past the French. Look at the French. 27% of French restaurants in New York City are very expensive. Okay, so that echo, I use some of this evidence to make an argument about popularity and prestige about it. So I'm going to, this is Michelin. I do the same with the Michelin data. Michelin first came to New York City 2006, and I have the most recent data on 2024. I'll get more updated data. And of course, you see American, contemporary, Italian, then Japanese, then French, then Chinese regional. By the way, for the first time, we are beginning to see Chinese regionalization beyond just Szechuan, et cetera. That has happened globally around it. And then you have Mexican, Korean, et cetera, et cetera. So now I want to say one more thing about this long history of Japonismo. Jason Farago, the critic of the New York Times, recently underlined the long history of migration and metabolization of Katsushika Hokusai, vivid composition and bourgeois themes in the West, prints by Gauguin and Whistler absorbed Hokusai's blocky colors and flattened spaces. Yes, exactly. Oh, there it is. Yeah, exactly. And so I'm going to go the previous one. Maybe I jumped. Oops, sorry. Okay, so you get a sense about this. So this is, of course, a view from outside in. And in a sharply reflective recent essay in the Journal of Asian American Studies, where Corinne Mitsui Sugino writes a critical cultural genealogy of Japanese foodways, she writes, I'll give you one example. She notes that Japan is a string of more than 7,000 islands in the Pacific with multiple indigenous communities, including the Ainu, okay, the Izumo, the Yamato, the Kumaso, etc., etc. So it is very unlikely to have one homogeneous and continuous culture so foreign to the Japanese state and internalized by Western mythologizers that it is cohesive, it is one thing. It's 7,000 islands with different languages. Okay, so in some ways, yet through colonial expansion, she notes the Yamato Japanese would universalize their own lineage while suppressing other languages, cultures, and communities, eventually coming to stand in for the Japanese as a singular ethnic group. So what's happening in the process, if you lose that sensibility, dynamic sensibility of why the visibility of Japanese now, in some ways, you also lose the construction of the Japanese as a one unified theme. And all of us know from the literature on nationalism that these are crafted in particular ways at a particular moment. You know, one homogeneous thing, which may look from very far as a homogeneous thing, is not at all homogeneous. Okay, we have seen and I talk a little bit about, I just want to show you, by the way, it's not just food. It's if you are into men's fashions, by the way, there have been kind of quite substantial presence of what is called IB from a reference to the Ivy League. And it's happening at a point of time when hip hop is dominating American urban culture. So IB or Ivy League, that kind of a style, migrates to Japan and returns to the US as this IB style. Okay, so many of these companies are basically playing with this kind of so it's a very direct relationship between, in some ways, the Japanese sensibility and the American sensibility. And those of you who are gamers, those of you who follow manga, in some ways, you know this kind of a intensive kind of a relationship. By the way, I've talked about this dynamic relationship between, say, US and Japan and cultural idioms. One could also pay some very specific attention to the use of Japanese, for instance, in the Northeast India today, as a counter-hegemonic posture against Indian racism. Okay, and and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Just because it's an inter-imperial relationship doesn't mean you don't have the capacity to interject kind of a subaltern element to it. In the Northeast, in fact, it is seen as kind of lovely work just emerging, including Beauty's work about, in fact, thinking through kind of this idiom about it. So maybe by the 21st century, it was clear that the quip from the Japanese co-star of Michael Douglas in the movie Black Rain, if you remember, some of you are too young, this is 1989. The Japanese guy says in this movie, music and movies are all your culture is good for. We make the machines. 1989. Okay? That has clearly been superseded. Now China makes the machines, and Japan the cultural idiom in numerous domains, including the comic and the culinary. Okay, so kind of here then I enumerate, this is a Korean cool that is borrowing heavily from Japanese cool. You see that exposed wood, you see those exposed walls, and of course, ceramics, often dented ceramics, handmade ceramics, not polished, remarkable use of empty space, not to pile up your plates with all kinds of things, okay, but which was very kind of 19th century and early 20th century phenomena about it. And we are beginning to see the transition in places like New York, in places even like Tokyo, to some of the Korean aesthetics, by the way. And in this case, by the way, kimchi. Kimchi becomes important largely through the diet of Japanese managers, where they would eat Japanese food, but have a side of kimchi. Okay, that comes together in a very interesting way in this kind of aesthetics of kind of taste about it. So here I kind of go through the details of it. I won't bore you with this. The reach of Japanese idioms. And so my big argument is any analysis of cultural politics without an understanding of economics and geopolitics is to confuse baking with the icing on the cake. Thank you. I hope some of you are bakers, so you know that, how that works.
Thank you, Krishnendu, for that wonderful